Good afternoon and welcome to yet another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. Today we continue Eugene Peterson, The Message. Today's episode is part 2 of 2. Last week we looked at Eugene Peterson, the man. Today we look at Eugene Peterson and his message paraphrase. We attempt to answer some questions. From what text did Eugene Peterson work? Did he have any help with his Bible? Where does it sit on that translation continuum chart? What are some examples of its distinctive readings? How was the message received? Did it have critics? Was it ever revised? And how should we evaluate his Bible today? It is to that story we now turn. So if you're finding these episodes helpful or educational in any way, please like and subscribe and share this channel with friends. So stay tuned as we discover more about Eugene Peterson and his message Bible from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. By way of review, Peterson earned his BA degree in philosophy from Seattle Pacific University in 1954. That was important because philosophy introduces you to the distinctions of language, nuances of meaning, which was helpful in his translation work. He went on to earn his Bachelor of Sacred Theology from the Biblical Seminary in New York in 1957. And then his MA degree in Semitic languages from Johns Hopkins in 1958. He never received an earned PhD, but he did have several honorary doctorates awarded to him. After his graduate study at Johns Hopkins, he returned to the Biblical Seminary in New York City, where he taught biblical languages and the English Bible. At the same time, he was a pastor at the Presbyterian Church in White Plains, New York. And it was there that he discovered his passion for pastoral work. Up to that point, he was pursuing an academic career, but he loved working with people, mentoring and shepherding them. And at that pastorate, that's where his love for this began. In 1962, he began a church plant in Bel Air, Maryland, and founded Christ Our King Presbyterian Church. And he served there for 29 years before retiring in 1991. And then he embarked upon a professor of spiritual theology at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, putting him back to his Northwest roots. And after retiring from Regent College, he returned to Montana with his wife, where he spent his remaining days and received and entertained many guests and visitors. Regarding the origin of the message, Peterson himself gives us his words.
Because I wanted to get the language of scriptures into an equivalent. See, both the Hebrew and Greek languages, they were not literary languages. If you were a philosopher or a poet or something else, you wrote in a different level of language. But in the Greek and in the Hebrew both, these are storytelling languages. They're street languages. A lot of the words that occur in the Bible don't occur in the Hebrew or Greek language, because they were never written. They were always voiced. So when I realized that, then I started taking more liberties with myself, and that's what came out. I really didn't think I was doing something that extraordinary. But I knew I was doing something for my congregation that was extraordinary. They were listening to this for the first time.
And so he started out. Later, in a book he published called Traveling Light, he included that translation of Galatians. And John Stein, editor at Nav Press, was impressed and encouraged Peterson to go ahead and try the rest of the New Testament as a paraphrase. But Peterson was reluctant. So Stein gave him a challenge just to paraphrase at least the first 10 chapters of Matthew. Peterson accepted. After he began that work, he admitted he was not very pleased. It seemed too wooden and too stiff, too traditional. But when he came to the Beatitudes, he decided to try a different approach. Peterson says that he sort of let go and became playful with the language. He completed the Beatitudes in 10 minutes with his approach. This is what he decided to do with the rest of his New Testament and his resulting complete Bible. Regarding his qualifications, he certainly was qualified to translate the Bible. He was educated in the biblical languages at seminary. His master's in Semitic languages, of course, at Johns Hopkins prepared him exceptionally well for the Old Testament. He taught classes in Hebrew and Greek at the seminary in New York City. He studied and read regularly from the Hebrew and Greek scriptures for years, and he felt very comfortable doing so. So what about his base text that he worked from in his translation? Well, he worked from the original Hebrew and Greek text. Although I haven't read anything explicitly naming the text, I can only assume that given his seminary work, he was using the Biblia Hebraica for the Old Testament and the Nestle-Aland edition for the Greek New Testament. What about his philosophy of translation? Well, his philosophy can be gleaned from the format and language of his translation and from things that he explicitly said about it. He intentionally avoided verse numbers and footnotes to prevent the Bible from feeling like a mere reference book. In later editions, however, he would approve including verse numbers. But he attempted to recreate for his generation a translation, as he said, would be in the common informal idiom of everyday speech, street language. And he wrote, "The goal is not to render a word-for-word conversion of Greek into English, but rather to convert the tone, the rhythm, the events, the ideas into the way we actually think and speak." So, did he have any help with his translation? Yes, he did, to some degree. How much and in what manner is not precisely clear to me, and I wish that I had more specifics on this account. According to the Message Bible Online FAQ page, Eugene Peterson is the sole translator of the message, but two teams of biblical scholars in Old and New Testaments carefully vetted his translation. Peterson's work has been thoroughly reviewed by the following teams of recognized Old and New Testament scholars who ensured it is accurate as well as faithful to the original languages. In my 2002 copy of the Message Bible, the names of 15 Old Testament translation consultants, as it is called, are provided. Robert Hubbard was the chair of the Old Testament team, and the rest would comprise Richard Averbeck, Brian Beyer, Lamar Cooper Sr., Peter Enns, Dwayne Garrett, Donald Glenn, Paul House, V. Phillips Long, Tremper Longman III, John Oswalt, Richard Pratt Jr., John Walton, Prescott Williams, and Marvin Wilson. These men, and they are all men, by the way, represent these evangelical schools: Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, the Criswell College, Dallas Theological Seminary, Gordon Conwell, Regent College, the Reformed Theological Seminary, Westminster Theological Seminary, Moody Bible Institute, and others. His 1993 New Testament cites 5 New Testament exegetical consultants. Again, all men. Number 1, Dr. William Klein was the chairman from Denver Seminary. Darrell Bach, Dallas Theological Seminary. Donald Hagner, Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Moises Silva, Westminster Theological Seminary. And Dr. Rodney Whitaker, a personal friend, Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry. These men likewise are all from conservative institutions and are conservative evangelical scholars. Both Peter E. Enns and John Walton on his Old Testament team are today considered by some to be liberal scholars. Now, it's likely that their earlier views in Peterson's day, in the 1990s, perhaps they were more conservative at that time, and they evolved into a more liberal approach later in life. Many scholars start out conservative, and they change their views as their academic career progresses. Bart Ehrman, for example, studied at Moody Bible Institute and was a very conservative Christian for a time. After his days at Princeton, he became an agnostic and has a reputation for extremely liberal viewpoints. Some questions that remain unanswered regarding these consultants that I have are, what exactly did they do for him? Did they read the translation in advance and provide recommendations? Did they ever suggest alternatives to his readings? Were any of their suggestions followed? And if so, which ones? Did they meet individually or as a committee? I haven't been able to get an answer to these questions, and I would love to know more. So if you have any information regarding this, please let me know in the comments. I would be very appreciative. Regarding its place on the translation continuum chart, the Message is considered to be a contemporary equivalent translation by the publisher, Nav Press. But as you see by looking at the chart, it is to the far right as a paraphrase, not a word-for-word translation or even a more mediating translation like the New International Version. Now let's look at some distinctive readings of the Message. We'll compare some familiar passages using the English Standard Version as a representative of a more literal translation. First, we look at the Lord's Prayer. I'm assuming you're familiar with the more traditional rendering. The Message reads, "Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Set the world right. Do what's best. As above, so below. Keep us alive with 3 square meals. Keep us forgiven with you and forgiving others. Keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. You're in charge. You can do anything you want. You're ablaze in beauty. Yes, yes, yes." I would say that's a rather dramatic rendering. Next, we look at the Beatitudes. English Standard Version on the left side of the screen and the Message on the right. "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there's more of God and His rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that cannot be bought," and so on. You get the picture of how it reads. Now, Peterson wanted very much to translate blessed as lucky, but his editor talked him out of it. And there's a story about that in Wynne Collier's official biography of Eugene Peterson that we referenced last week. Next, let's look at 1 Corinthians 13. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always, always looks for the best, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Then there's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it even without thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. There are some personal observations that I've made while reading through the Gospels. For example, Matthew 1, verse 18 in the Message. The birth of Jesus took place like this. His mother, Mary, was engaged to be married to Joseph. Before they enjoyed their wedding night, Joseph discovered she was pregnant. It was by the Holy Spirit, but he didn't know that. Now, the Greek text explicitly says the birth of Jesus Christ took place like this. And I'm not quite sure why Peterson would fail to translate Christ. It is very well attested in the Greek text, so it remains a mystery to me. It could have just been an oversight. The phrase, "but he didn't know that," has no equivalent in the Greek text. It's probably a true statement, but Peterson has a tendency to elaborate like the Amplified Bible does. There are at least 6 reasons that I know of to paraphrase, and let me just mention those to you. Number 1, you might choose to paraphrase to clarify or explain. Number 2, to emphasize. Number 3, to make explicit something that's not. Number 4, to exaggerate. Number 5, to summarize. And 6, to create a dramatic effect. Eugene Peterson uses all 6. Now, the issue with paraphrases is not necessarily the paraphrase. The issue is that many of those who are reading a paraphrase do not know they are reading a paraphrase. They believe they are reading the very words of God, and the elaboration in the text is taken as what was actually written long ago. But it is not so. A well-turned phrase in a paraphrase can be a very good reading, but an unnecessary elaboration of words can sometimes lead to ideas the author never had in mind. A paraphrase by a single author usually reveals the mind, the experiences, the preferences, and thoughts of the translator. And sometimes when I read the Message, I feel that I'm learning more about Eugene Peterson than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's look at Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and compare the ESV, which says, "In those days John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" The Message says, "While Jesus was living in the Galilean hills, John, called the Baptizer, was preaching in the desert country of Judea. His message was simple and austere, like his desert surroundings. Change your life. God's kingdom is here." Now, the first phrase, "while Jesus was living in the Galilean hills," has no equivalent in the Greek text. This is Peterson simply setting the stage for what comes next. In the same way, the phrase, "his message was simple and austere, like his desert surroundings," has absolutely no equivalent in the Greek text. Peterson likes to add what I call color commentary to many passages in the Gospels. And these additions are likely true, but are nonetheless not to be confused with the original words of the author. But this is the nature of a paraphrase, to explain, to elaborate, to paint a picture of the scene. And Eugene Peterson does this freely. 2 more examples will suffice. Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, the English Standard Version says, "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, not as their scribes." Straightforward, literal translation. The Message reads, "When Jesus concluded his address, the crowd burst into applause. They had never heard teaching like this. It was apparent he was living everything he was saying, quite a contrast to their religion teachers. This was the best teaching they had ever heard." Many of the words in this passage, like "the crowd burst into applause," have no Greek textual basis, but are simply elaboration for dramatic effect. Again, Matthew chapter 8, verse 1, the English Standard Version reads, "When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him." The Message reads, "Jesus came down the mountain with the cheers of the crowd still ringing in his ears." It's obvious that Peterson likes a dramatic effect, a kind of on-the-scene report, if you will. Now, there are many, very many good readings in The Message, and I particularly like how he captures the scene in Mark chapter 2 with the story of the paralytic let down from the roof. It is vivid, exciting, and dramatic, as surely the original event was. You should read it for yourself and feel the drama. It's a really great passage. Now, how was the Message received in its day, and even now? Well, as you might expect, it's a mixed bag. It received both praise and criticism. Many appreciated its refreshing contemporary phrases and praised its ability to make the stories of the Bible vivid and alive. And it had many endorsements. Bono, Max Lucado, Frederick Buechner, J.I. Packer, just to name a few. But it also had critics. There were some purist theologians, we might say, who disliked its overly wordy commentary and feared it would lead many readers away from the original words of Scripture. But this exactly is what a paraphrase is. It will intentionally be more wordy. Some have even said it is a New Age Bible, whatever that is. Despite its polarized reception, it is proven to be a favored translation, or paraphrase rather, by many people worldwide. There was even a Catholic version released in 2013. Now, some have criticized the Message as being weak on translating certain passages on homosexuality, such as Genesis 19, the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah, or Romans 1, 26 and 27, and 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. I'll leave it to you to read those passages, compare them to a more literal translation, and you be the judge. But Peterson is on record as saying that he chose to leave out the word homosexual in his translation of the Message because he found the word, as he said, no longer treated in terms of an immoral behavior, but as an immoral identity, which is then attacked as an enemy. He said the term has been used so frequently in mean and dehumanizing ways, it's difficult to use it in the spirit of Paul and Jesus and our culture. He may have a point here. What do you think? Was the Message Bible ever revised? Yes, it was, in 2018. Again, according to the official FAQ, language changes over time, often faster than we realize. A particular challenge for a Bible in a contemporary language is to regularly review phrases that have become outdated or unhelpful. Our review of the Message was constrained by a commitment to not fix what wasn't broken, but to retain Eugene's original vision for his distinct translation and to faithfully reflect the Bible's timeliness and timelessness. The result was an aesthetic revision of the Message with spot-specific changes that would support ongoing readability over time. These changes were made with the oversight of biblical scholars and authorized by Eugene Peterson himself. In the description below, I have provided a link to the changes that were made in the 2018 revisions, and you can see it there. So how do we evaluate the Message? I think that as long as you understand the nature of paraphrase and you expect a wordier, more verbose reading, then this version can be profitably read alongside a more literal translation. Is it the Bible? In my humble opinion, no. But it is a paraphrase of it, and in many cases, a good paraphrase. It does stray into unnecessary elaboration often, and is some wording which will quickly become dated. But at the same time, it can provide a vivid reading that captures the drama of the moment, such as in Mark chapter 2 and the paralytic. Keep your English Standard Version or a more literal rendering nearby when you read it. It is not a study Bible. It wasn't intended to be, and Eugene Peterson knew it. We'll conclude with his own words in the preface to the message. He said, "The Message is a reading Bible. It is not intended to replace the excellent study Bibles that are available. My intent here is to simply get people reading it who don't know that the Bible is readable, and to get people who long ago lost interest in the Bible to read it again. So at some point along the way, soon or late, it will be important to get a standard study Bible to facilitate further study." I think he's spot on. Wise advice from the man himself. So, what do you think of the message? Do you read it? Is it read in your church from the pulpit? Do you have any criticisms of it? Would you recommend it to others? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And we appreciate you for listening to this episode on Eugene Peterson. Now, next week, we'll continue along the path of the history of the English Bible. So we'll see you soon. And until next week, so long from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.